In the last 5 years, companies started hiring data engineers. A data engineer creates the systems that manage and access the huge volumes of data that are accumulating on cheap cloud servers. As the saying goes, it's more expensive to throw out the data than to store it. In today's episode, Pete Soderling joins the show to discuss the rise of the data engineer and how that role interacts with data scientists, software engineers, and machine learning experts. Pete runs Hakka Labs, a site that aggregates material for data science and data engineering. He also organizes DataEngConf, a conference for data engineering. And speaking of conferences and social gatherings around software, if you are in the Bay Area on January 11th, come check out the Software Engineering Daily Meetup. There will be some awesome speakers, some food, a great atmosphere, and you can find more information on softwareengineeringdaily.com or at the Software Engineering Daily Meetup page. It's at Galvanize in San Francisco, and I hope to see you there. Life is too short to have a job that you don't enjoy. If you don't like your job, go to hired.com/sedaily. Hired makes finding a new job enjoyable, and Hired will connect you with a talent advocate that will walk you through the process of finding a better job. It's like a personal concierge for finding a job. Maybe you want more flexible hours or more money or remote work. Maybe you want to work at Facebook or Uber or Stripe or some of the other top companies that are desperately looking for engineers on Hired. You deserve a job that you enjoy because you're someone who spends their spare time listening to a software engineering podcast. Clearly, you're passionate about software, so it's definitely possible to find a job that you enjoy. Check out hired.com/sedaily to get a special offer for Software Engineering Daily listeners. A $1,000 signing bonus from Hired when you find that great job that gives you respect and salary that you deserve as a great engineer. I love Hired because it puts more power in the hands of engineers. Go to hired.com/sedaily to get advantage of that special offer. And thanks to Hired for being a continued longtime sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. Pete Soderling runs Hakka Labs, a platform for data engineers. Pete, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Thanks. Great to be here.
From my perspective, data engineering is this specialization that arose because of a variety of factors. It became cheaper for companies to store their data, so users are engaging with their devices more, there's more data to store. And in order to make use of that data, you actually need a data scientist at your company to perform analysis on it. You don't get value out of the data by just having it stored on your servers. And then the data scientists, they're experts in doing data analysis. They're not necessarily experts in the scalable distributed systems. So we needed new architectural patterns to handle all of this data and perform analysis. And this role called data engineer arose. Would you say that's an accurate explanation for the kind of historical origin of the data engineer role?
Yeah, partially. I think that you just articulated some really present meaningful dynamics in data teams, the interplay between the data scientist and the data engineer and what that really means. And that's a key thing that I'm interested from a community building and conference building standpoint. But I think the other thing that's even maybe more obvious that might get skipped over is just the plethora of consumer data that's come online through social networks and other large internet platforms over the last 10 years. Just the prevalence of that data in and of itself has sort of pushed forward processing architectures and just the need for companies to be able to capture that in performant ways.
So this role, data engineer, a company like Spotify or Netflix, maybe there were engineers who were spending all their time at this company. They were building infrastructure for data, and they weren't spending any time building user-facing services. So eventually they just became this role of data engineer. And then over time, this has pervaded more and more companies. What have you seen in the evolution of this emphasis on data engineering in the last 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, I
Like,
think.
how has that affected the structure of companies?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. No one is born a data engineer. Data engineers come from all kinds of other backgrounds. Some were DBAs, some were backend engineers, some were distributed systems engineers. There's a whole moniker, data engineer. It's such a new term, and probably about 3 or 4 years ago, when we started the data engineering meetup in New York and San Francisco, the term was not even necessarily in common knowledge. Like, you didn't have a title data engineer unless you worked at perhaps Facebook or maybe Google, companies that had like such large amounts of data historically. So now we're starting to see the term sort of be defined as we start to play with it. And as a complement to data science, I think there's a lot of like sort of latent definition that makes sense. But even before a data engineer is in contrast to a data scientist, I think there's a bigger meme, which is that software engineers are eating all of the other kinds of roles and teams. So when I was an engineer in the late 90s, we had a QA department, and we had an infrastructure department, and we had a DBA team, and we had a software web engineering team. And now it seems like software engineers just overall are eating all of those roles. So part of that, I think, bubbles up with data engineering, where a lot of teams, don't even necessarily have a DBA team anymore. It's just sort of expected that the software engineers do that work. So I think there's a couple of different like kind of sociological pressures that have made the data engineer emerge today as what it is, and it's still obviously being defined.
And what have you been doing the last 5 or 10 years as we have had this boom in data engineering? From what vantage point have you been watching this evolve?
Yeah, so my quick history from 10,000 feet is I'm a self-taught engineer from the early 90s, turned web engineer in the late 90s and early 2000s. I sort of hit the first internet bubble in stride. Then in 2003, I discovered I probably wasn't as great of an engineer as I wanted to be, and maybe I should do something slightly different. So I started my first company. I've been super passionate about technology and engineering ever since, and didn't want to leave the field, even though I just wasn't the best engineer. So I decided to do stuff in the vein of either helping engineers with their career, or in the case of my second startup, Strata Security, we built an online cloud-based data processing platform in 2008 and 2009. That was sort of very early at its time. So I've been highly involved in building technical products in the data space. And then most recently, over the last 5 years, I've been building community for engineers. So Hakka Labs, which is my current company, which was the precursor to DataEngConf, Hakka Labs was building an online platform similar to LinkedIn to help connect engineers together to help them solve problems, find mentors, or find careers. So it was sort of the holy grail social network for engineers that I don't think anyone has successfully been able to build yet. But I spun around that space for a while, and ultimately,
Though many have tried.
yeah, many have tried, and some would argue that GitHub is a social network, which it is not. It's a tool for code hosting and collaboration with people that you mostly already know, not for discovering engineers that you don't know. So I have a lot to say about sort of social networks and engineers, but we engineers are not typically that social, so sometimes it's a bit like pushing a rock up a hill. So that would be a whole other part of the story that I could get into, but I had a big, long detour with building social platforms for engineers, and finally I gave up on that and realized that through some of the meetups we had started, data engineering and others, we were building real community for engineers, IRL, and so we abandoned, at least for now, the digital version of that platform and decided to focus on events for engineers, and that's how the DataEngConf was born, which we started last year.
It is funny how these communities tend to develop from things that you don't expect to form into a community, or you don't plan. I mean, in terms of this podcast, I can relate to what you said about not wanting to be. You maybe realize, oh, okay, I'm not the best engineer, so I should start and lead something. which by the way might be counterintuitive for some people. They might think, well, if I'm not the best engineer at a company, why on earth would I start a company? Don't you have to be the best engineer to start a company? And that's definitely not true. That's kind of a side note. But as this podcast has gotten kind of popular, like a community has kind of developed around it, just coincidentally, which is just interesting. It seems like that it happens anytime you have a product that is actually useful to people.
I think that's a great point. Developing a set of engaged users can happen around a product, and that's what a lot of us shoot for. A lot of us who are serial startup founders shoot for, and that's a beautiful thing. I guess when I started Hakka Labs, I knew I wanted to build something to help engineers with their careers, partly because I was a self-taught engineer and was always kind of feeling my way around, and partly because I saw a lot of other engineers who didn't necessarily have set career paths that they recognized. They had the sense that they wanted to be a CTO, but they didn't realize there's at least 3 or 4 different kinds of CTOs. They didn't really know how to get there, let alone choose which one they wanted. And perhaps they even, they weren't particularly strong at some of the social skills or like network building that someone like a salesperson, for instance, does sort of by second nature. So when I started Hakka Labs, I knew I wanted to help engineers with these kinds of problems, but I didn't know what the product was. So I didn't start with a product. I just started trying to engage engineers with content. Originally, it was an email newsletter that I sent out just to see if I could get them to care and engage about the kinds of stuff that I thought I had a thesis around the business. And so we started building community through content even before we had a product. And it was later on that the product emerged that we then dropped into this somewhat vibrant community we had and took a spin at the product side. But we kind of worked outside in, which is not something that a lot of people do. And I think it's just proof of the fact that getting engagement with users in any kind of way around a particular theme can help you advance your thesis or not.
When I'm choosing the tools for my side projects, the first thing that I look for is ease of use. That's why I love MongoDB. It is the most popular non-relational database, and it is super easy to use. At the beginning of a project, I often don't know the shape of my objects, and Mongo makes it easy to evolve the database schema as I like over time. Over time, as my project gets popular, I'm going to need to scale, and thankfully, MongoDB has built-in horizontal scalability, but configuration and database maintenance aren't really what I want to spend my time on. Thankfully, MongoDB Atlas was released in 2016. MongoDB Atlas is the easiest way to get access to MongoDB without having to run the database yourself. You pay only for what you use, from small projects all the way up to large production deployments. To try MongoDB Atlas today, go to mongodb.com/sedaily and get a free $25 in credit. Use promo code GOATLAS25 to get that $25 in free credit. Atlas is the only hosted MongoDB service built by the engineers behind the database, the company MongoDB. With Atlas, you get end-to-end encryption, you get VPC peering, you get access to the latest releases, and for a limited time, you can go to mongodb.com/sedaily, enter promo code GOATLAS25, and get that $25 in credit and get started with MongoDB Atlas. Thanks to MongoDB for being a new sponsor of Software Engineering Daily, and thanks for being the database behind a lot of my favorite side projects in the past. We're really happy to have MongoDB as a new sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. The idea of building a social network for engineers, I'm a little curious about your attempt at that and what went wrong. The thesis for this company is for the social network for engineers company is always like, if we get these engineers together and they're all on this platform, it's a great place to give them ideas for jobs and maybe serve them ads for um, engineering products with a high
Mm-hmm.
CLTV.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very compelling idea, and it seems like I'm an engineer. I would want a social network for engineers. I spend time on Stack Overflow. I spend time on GitHub. Whether or not it's a social network, we could debate. But what was the difficulty? Like, was it classic chicken and egg thing, or what happened?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, with a social network, I think it's always classic chicken and egg thing. But I think now we have more tools that help us start to, blow that problem apart and get more atomic about how to get to scale. No social network starts at scale. Getting to scale is the holy grail, and if you do, presumably it has so much value for every person in the network in different ways that you succeed. But there's just no possible way to start a network in that with that mechanism. So, I think with the product, sort of what we know about starting products and traction and solving a user's pain, a social network for engineers, it's no different. Like we fought long and hard to find out like what specifically is the pain of the engineer that we can solve, and how can we do that in the first person, or the player one use case, where we don't require all the value of the network to solve that problem, because to be honest, we don't have that network yet. So finding the smallest bit of pain that you can solve for engineers was really challenging for us, with engineering tooling and other stuff sort of, being fairly well developed. So that was the challenge, and I could talk you through a couple of the ways that we tried to do that, but it didn't look like a social network necessarily at smallest scale, just because it can't. You can't say you're going to launch a social network and launch a social network and succeed, which is not what most people think, but it's definitely true.
Right, and so this pain sounds like the small modicum of pain that you found was conferences for data engineers and data scientists, perhaps the content aggregation tool that Hakka Labs has developed into. So, I mean, we'll get back to talking about that, but let's talk a little bit more about like data engineering and what's going on with the world of data engineering. Maybe that'll make it more clear to the listeners, why there's some areas of pain. So, is data engineering like a well-defined role? Like, do we have a good picture for what it is? Does it overlap with what a data scientist does? How well understood, in the engineering community is the role of a data engineer and the skills that a data engineer needs to have?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's definitely in evolution. We're mid-formation of this field, and I think a lot of it is being driven by data science because we've had such great advances in the last few years in deep learning, and companies successfully like training models on huge amounts of data that are becoming meaningful and far more effective from a product standpoint. So I think that the quanti data sciencey machine learning AI stuff is like very sexy, and it's finally coming into its own. Obviously, I think there's a whole different discipline that requires somebody to parse, process, clean, ETL, present, and tee up that data for the quants to do anything with in the first place. And that I think is data engineering. Now, that being said, there's a lot of tensions in sort of current teams. Whether you're a startup and you want insights from data, so you go and hire your first data person and you hire a data scientist because that's what you do, right? And then the data science comes to work on the first day, and there's no data in any organized place, and it's strewn all over 14 different systems, and all of a sudden the data scientist has to sort of do his or her own engineering to like pull that data together. That's a very common pitfall we see in startup teams where they think they need a data scientist. Maybe they actually need a data engineer first. And then of course there's the unicorn folks, the machine learning engineer, someone who can put both pieces together. And that's an interesting, sort of formation of skills as well, which is highly, highly valuable. But many folks are not of that type.
So ignoring the unicorn engineer, if we're talking about a company that is big enough to hire both a data engineer and a data scientist, or even a data engineering team and a data science team. Is there a rough contract between the data engineer and the data scientist? What is in the purview of the data engineer and what is in the purview of the data scientist?
Yeah, I think, what I see across industries, not just startups. I've worked with a lot of small teams. I worked with a lot of like top technical teams, like teams from Google or Facebook or Amazon. But then there's also the enterprise, sort of version of these teams, or there's the finance version of these teams, right? Like quanti data sciencey stuff in Wall Street is super pervasive, and those teams have probably been working together almost as long as any data teams because originally, in the late 90s and early 2000s, where I was working in New York, building high frequency, low latency trading platforms was something that, those were some of the earliest data engineers, you might say, who were teeing up that stuff for the quants in Wall Street to work on. So some of this stuff is, interestingly enough, it's buried in Wall Street, and it's being sort of uncovered or rediscovered by technical teams. By the way, I think it's no surprise that DoubleClick in New York came out of the sort of the Wall Street culture, and even to have a bid buy ad model for an ad network was novel at the time. No surprise that DoubleClick was started in New York. Plus, there's a lot of like high frequency, low latency engineering rigor that was required in a company like DoubleClick that I think was like there was an underpinning of Wall Street talent that sort of helped that company succeed. Anyway, that's sort of an aside.
No. So actually, I did an interview earlier today with Shalan Dar. I don't know if you've heard or if you follow the ad industry much, but I've been doing a bunch of shows about ad tech and like ad fraud, and it's just funny because there's all these ad tech companies in New York. And it's like, wow, why is ad tech so big in New York?
Mm-hmm.
And it's because the layers of obfuscation and the auction models and the complexity of Wall Street completely mirrors that of advertising technology, where you have buying and selling and derivatives and repackaging, except it is even less regulated than Wall Street. And
it's fascinating.
So
it's definitely a big part of the New York City engineering culture. I've lived in both New York City and San Francisco Bay Area, and I deeply, deeply respect the engineering culture of the Bay Area, and I've learned things there that I never would have learned anywhere else. And it's amazing, especially from a product and product culture and engineering culture, tech companies. But New York has its own little sort of value in the software engineering universe, and it's very strong when it comes to data. So, going back to your question about how do these teams interact together, again, I think it depends on sort of the size of your team. But this is one of the things we're trying to uncover with the data engineering conference and the community is we saw a few years ago that there were these questions about how these different personalities and roles and skill sets and sides of the house needed to interact with each other across data engineering and data science. And so the whole original mission of DataEngConf was to bridge the gap between data engineering and data science and to put both groups in the same room, because there's ICML and there's other machine learning conferences that are sort of catered towards academic research and really hardcore algos on the machine learning and data science side. And then there was this emerging engineering world of data engineering and Hadoop and all this stuff. And when you put these two trained people into a data team, oftentimes sparks fly, and one's not an engineer. And the other, the engineer who's responsible to implement productionized code of machine learning models, doesn't necessarily all the time know even the basic math about the algos that they're deploying. So we saw these sparks fly on teams in real life and decided, well, it's time to try to bridge the gap between those two And even if we don't have all the answers, which I don't, at least we can create a community ecosystem where we can put these two groups together in the same room, through content, through conference, through community, and help them sort of figure it out. And that's actually the mission of DataEngConf, is to explore this dynamic between data engineers and data scientists.
Sounds like the DevOps movement.
Yeah, there you go. Not dissimilar. Absolutely.
You could have called it like DataConf or Inch the Inch movement. That's not as catchy. It's not as catchy as DevOps.
I've never been good at naming things. So and
or Scienge. What about Scienge?
I like it. I mean, already the conference brand and
breaking
vision
down the silos between data engineering and data science. Scienge.
It's good.
Yeah,
it's good.
Is there some pretty severe siloing between the data engineering teams and the data science teams?
Yeah, totally. I think it depends.
So is it like a level of resentment that happens between development and operations, or is it like more subtle?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if it's quite as representative of that similar level of resentment, which I remember very acutely, like being an engineer in the late 90s. And I think that data.
No, by the way, it's still exists today. I mean, my first job out of school. Speaking of trading company, I remember I worked at a trading company. I remember oh my goodness, there are so many like operational difficulties that at a high frequency trading company, and the relationship between the engineering team and the operations team is fraught, Shakespearean.
Right. Well, I love how a company like Etsy is just like, this is an aside, but turned that all on its head and just like brazenly declares, if you build it, you run it, you operate it. So it's not even about giving engineers the keys to the infrastructure, the production system. It's just sort of assumed from day one. So that was a bold move, and I think they've been a great forerunner for some of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about some of the areas of data engineering. This space is moving so fast. It is so congested with all these different technologies. I had a show a while ago with Chris Fregley, who does these you've heard of this guy?
Absolutely. Yeah, I know Chris.
Right. Okay, so he does this like Pancake Stack presentation. Like Pancake Stack is a 12-letter or 13-letter acronym of all these different technologies. And like most quote stacks are like four lamp stack. That's like 4 technologies, and this is like a 13 or 14 technology stack. So it's kind of a joke, but like the punchline is just that the stacks are so thick. So whether you're talking about, it's like, okay, our stack consists of Kafka, Cassandra, Docker, Mesos, and then 8 other technologies, and there's just all this churn. So I guess let's talk more broadly. Like, I think the idea of the Pancake Stack is basically like, look, you've got this huge pipeline and you've got some requirements. What are the requirements for a data engineering pipeline?
Yeah, well, this is something that's definitely changing all the time. I mean, I guess I was first sort of made aware of the need for new and different technology like years ago with the NoSQL movement. And when we were all coming out of MySQL or Postgres, or not even coming out of just like really using hard relational databases, the NoSQL world started to explode, because of cap theorem dynamics and some new research there. So I remember at the time, this was probably my first exposure to like how complicated data processing stacks could become when it was simply about trying to choose a NoSQL store. Like, did you need something key value in memory? Did you need something that just had eventual consistency? Like, why did you want to get away from a relational data store in the first place? Like, did you need a document store like Mongo? And what the hell is Mongo good for anyway? Like, there's all these kinds of questions. And that was just a microcosm, I think you're right, of how complicated stuff would get, even now in the present day, where there's all kinds of different options for stream processing versus batch processing, and Kafka sort of emerged as the standard, and is Spark taking over Hadoop, and all these kinds of things. And I don't have definitive answers to all these things because I'm not a super hands-on engineer, but it is exciting to see this world explode. And again, just to try to give engineers expert context from members of our community to try to answer these problems and help them figure out like what is a reference implementation for a data pipeline. That's something that's changed over time, and we want to be the community that helps engineers discover what's right for them and which tools they should use.
Right, and I was looking at the Hakka Labs blog and just looking at all these posts about videos, YouTube videos, and conference talks and things about data engineering, and it was very useful to me. I was just getting a lot of ideas for shows I could potentially do just by looking at this aggregation of posts that you have. I mean, like when I go on YouTube, I can get, I've watched so many videos about different software engineering topics. The YouTube recommendations are decent, but this was really a nice curated blog about data engineering. So anybody who's interested in that, I recommend checking out the Hakka Labs blog. Machine learning, it really looks like it's going to be crucial to competitive edge, and it's only going to get more crucial. How is that? I mean, is that the driving one of the driving? I guess that must be one of the driving forces behind how aggressively data engineers are being hired. How aggressively companies are scrambling to get their data engineering pipelines set up in a way that is easy to manage, because until you get that data pipeline set up in a nice way, it's probably hard to build machine learning models.
Yeah, I think there's and that's one. I think there's a couple ways to kind of follow up to your comment. One is the strategic value of machine learning, and that can kind of take us in a different direction if you want to chat about that. But before that, the other thing is, I think there's a lot of engineers out there, and we discovered this early on in building the DataEng community. There's a lot of engineers that are kind of they're listening to the sirens call of machine learning and data science, and they kind of wish they could pick up some of that stuff. And so here they are, like building these pipelines and teeing up the stuff for the real quants. But engineers are a highly technical bunch, and we know math too, and we should like dabble in data science. And we're tired of just playing with weighting parameters in Elasticsearch, and we want to write some real algos ourselves. So one of the things that we've seen in our community is this like real hunger for engineers to learn more about data science, and we try to pour gasoline on that because we think it's good for both sides to sort of understand each other's language. I think a lot of engineers start to dabble in data science, and they realize at first blush like how much math is involved, and they learn quickly like which aspects of linear algebra and other things they need to go back and sort of brush up on. And by getting closer to the data science and the real math of the algos, they're able to determine whether or not, how deep they want to go in data science, and do they really want to like become a data scientist or augment their engineering skills to become a machine learning engineer, or were they happy with that brush and now they go back to being an engineer, but at least they speak the language of the data scientist, and can implement those algos in a little bit more logical, reasonable way.
I was at an event last night at App Academy. I was talking to some students who are graduating this coding boot camp, and I was saying that if you don't like the job prospects that you're getting coming out of a coding boot camp, you could, and you have some cash saved up. If you still have some cash saved up, you could spend some money, or not spend money. You could spend some time just learning data science or data engineering, learning machine learning, because this stuff is actually pretty approachable. Like, it seems like, oh my gosh, machine learning seems kind of crazy, but the tooling has gotten so simple, and the educational resources have gotten so good that you actually don't need to spend that much time before you're like really like employable as a machine learning not expert, but you'll be somebody that's useful to a company, because there's actually there's such a dearth of expertise relative to how useful these tools are. Do you think that's accurate? Is it that easy, or was I being reductive?
Yeah, I think there's definitely the opportunity.
Do you think a boot camp graduate can spend 2 months on Coursera and become good enough to be like a data engineer, a data scientist?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's other challenges to these boot camps, which, maybe is beyond our conversation a bit. I think they're great, but I think that real world experience and real project experience is so key. And I think that a lot of folks coming out of boot camps are learning this the hard way. But specifically to your point, absolutely, there's so much info online. Coursera probably kicked it off with some of their data science stuff, but I'm also reminded of Clara Corthell, who published something on GitHub called the Open Source Data Science Masters, and it's her version of a curriculum for data science. And if you work through that, especially if you have additional project experience, or perhaps you're already an engineer and you just want to sort of become familiar with like the ins and outs, like I mentioned, of how deep would you have to go to actually become a data scientist. Resources like that online are extremely valuable, and they're free, and they're open and available to everyone.
There are some areas of data. Well, I don't really know if this is data engineering, but like these companies, like big companies, like like an Etsy, for example, has so much monitoring data and log data. Is that a responsibility of a data engineer? Does the data engineer manage the monitoring and log data, or is that like a different role?
That's a great question. We've had some companies speak on anomaly detection in production systems at our conference over the last year, and I think this is a really interesting emerging, and it's super highly technical, right? Like, we're not talking about really any user face over some data product. We're talking about a tool by engineers for engineers to crunch log data to help engineers from an alerting perspective, like determine the health of their systems. I mean, it's sort of like this awesome engineering use case where we get to use data science like just to eat our own dog food, which is pretty incredible. So I think some of the largest internet companies are investing in this, and they're building custom systems to do this. I mean, something like that. If I were to set, if as a founder and sort of a product guy, if I were to set up a team internally to build that tool, that would be a data engineer, that would be a data scientist, that would be a product manager, and that might be obviously someone from the DevOps or infrastructure team to sort of like make sense of all of the infrastructure process and procedure as well. But I think that would be a fascinating tool to build. And I know that some of the largest companies are currently working on that.
Your company runs on Apple devices. Developers use Apple laptops, project managers use iPads, and everyone uses an iPhone. Jamf Now is a cloud-based mobile device management solution for iPads, iPhones, and Macs in your workplace. Jamf Now makes device management accessible and affordable for everyone, so businesses can support their users without help from the IT department. With Jamf Now, you can configure settings on all of your Apple devices quickly and consistently over the air, and Jamf Now allows you to manage your devices by centrally deploying apps anytime from anywhere. You can create a free account today at jamf.com/sedaily. That's jamf.com/sedaily. Use Jamf Now to ensure that the sensitive company information that your employees access on their Apple devices remains secure. Enforce passcodes and encryption over the air. Even remotely lock or wipe a device. See how easy it is to set up, manage, and secure your Apple devices anytime from anywhere. Manage your first 3 devices for free, and you can add more for just $2 per device per month. Create your free account today at jamf.com/sedaily. That's jamf.com/sedaily. Speaking of Etsy, I did a show with James Turnbull, who is the in Etsy. He's been done operations at a lot of different companies. He's very big in the DevOps community or monitoring community, whatever you want to call it. But I had him on to talk about his book, The Art of Monitoring, and he talked about monitoring data as business data. It is of business value. You can scrutinize the monitoring data, obviously for anomaly detection, like you said, or for things that are causing downtime. You can correlate these things, but you can also just like look at it for ways to maybe cut costs, or because there's so much data coming off and because our infrastructure has gotten so complex, by simply piping that data into ways that let you visualize it, like just having a dashboard basically, can be really, really high value, because once you get that data aggregated into a way that you can visualize, you'll be like, oh, like this is pretty wasteful. We should not have this, stuff over here. Well, this will cut $200,000 of cost. Simple decision. But back to what I was asking you about is like this, being able to grasp and manipulate this data is so complex because these streams are moving so fast. They're producing so much data. It is a data engineering problem. Collecting your monitoring data is as complex of a data engineering problem as collecting all of the user data that's from using Facebook on your phone or something. Basically the same problem.
Yeah, absolutely true. There's all of this data going through Amazon's cloud. Even from a strategic standpoint, because I think sometimes like a product person and even an investor, Microsoft just released, Google Cloud released a bunch of machine learning APIs just before Thanksgiving that are sort of new ways to get value from the Google Cloud. If you deploy your apps there, you get value through these machine learning APIs, and in some cases, these machine learning APIs are actually representative of different products that even aren't your own. But Google has the ability to build these highly relevant machine learning AI-based APIs because they have so much data to train. And if that's another reason for you to deploy your app on Google Cloud, they'll have even more data to train their APIs with. So this gets more to the strategy of like what place does machine learning have for different size companies, whether you're a startup or a medium or a large company. But there's some really interesting things happening with the aggregation of all this data, especially on public or semi-public clouds, what we think of as public clouds.
You talk more about that Google stuff because this is a question I'm asking a lot of guests is, what are the differentiating factors between the Google Cloud and the Amazon Cloud, perhaps the Microsoft Cloud, as we evolve into the future? Right now it looks like these clouds are kind of trying to replicate each other because we're still in very early days of cloud. We're still just building the basic compute primitives, stuff like queuing and just basic storage, database technology. But we're gonna see more and more of these high-level services or APIs, and it sounds like you're talking about something with Google, these machine learning APIs. What exactly do you mean by that? And are these things that are extremely differentiated on Google? Are they not represented on AWS?
Yeah, so the services I mentioned, just to be clear, that Google announced, like they have a job search API, and I forget some of the other ones. Yeah, it's if you check out the Google Cloud blog, it was a way to find relevant jobs based on skill sets, from what I recall. It's sort of I don't know if it's a Skunkworks project or exactly what their strategy is there, but they're sort of showing how machine learning APIs deployed by Google can leverage a lot of the data and the relevancy algorithms that Google has already built. So these APIs that I'm mentioning specifically might not be a reason necessarily right now to choose Google Cloud over AWS or other services. Although, I know Azure is also developing machine learning tools in their cloud as well. So it's kind of very early on with some of this stuff. So I don't want to sort of punch above my weight class here, but we're starting to see interesting stuff emerge, especially as it relates to machine learning features and services being offered by these clouds. And I think it may become a competitive differentiation at some point.
So this job search API, are you saying this is like Google crawled the internet for jobs, or it's something where you can like customize it yourself? I don't quite understand.
Yeah, they call it the Google Cloud Jobs API, and you can read about it on the cloud platform blog that Google runs. It was just announced before Thanksgiving, so I probably shouldn't talk about it like too specifically because
Sure.
I'm gonna butcher some details and misrepresent it. But if anyone's interested, they can find info on the Google Cloud Platform blog.
Yeah, see, this is like some next level stuff. I'm looking at it now. Dynamic recommendation engine, real time query, broadening, seniority alignment. This is some real. It says Cloud Jobs API Alpha. It's an alpha. Job search and discovery powered by machine learning. Wow. Well,
Yeah,
I
so
don't know of any.
that's probably the most tangential thing. I just pulled up the blog post as well to refresh my
Yeah.
memory. That's probably the most tangential thing, and I probably shouldn't have rushed to use that as an example. But
No,
um,
no.
the,
I think it's a perfect example because the reason it's a perfect example is it shows like how high level the APIs that people are going to build on top of their clouds are, and like this is still a very technical product, but it's not like storage
right,
and
right.
queuing and EC2. It's like totally differentiated. That's why like cloud is not exactly a commodity business. Like we're in the commodity days right now, but as time goes on, they're going to look less and less commodified.
Well, it's interesting. In the same blog post, this is the jobs API is the highest level API that they talk about. Then in the same blog post is bundled stuff on how they're announcing GPUs for Google Cloud, and how they have this Cloud Vision API where you can pump in images and get image recognition capabilities. So both in the same blog post, they have both like low level and high level kind of stuff, and it's all lumped together into machine learning features, and even a new group within Google for cloud machine learning tools. But you see all this stuff sort of emerge all at one time in the same blog post, which is kind of fascinating.
Exciting times. Okay, well, so we should talk a little bit more about Hakka Labs and DataEngConf, your community that you're building. So, as I understand, Hakka Labs is this. It started as this platform for connecting data engineers, data scientists, companies. It evolved into this blog where there's all these posts and videos about data engineering. And at a certain point, you decide to start a conference. You've been doing meetups and stuff. Where is the company at today, or what are you doing in regards to the conferences?
Yeah, so and this is where I could put on my founder hat and talk like a founder. Building any community, we started off talking about building a social network, and monetizing a social network that's not at scale is relatively impossible. So sort of just because of the economic pressures of what we were trying to build and the fact that we had some traction but not enough traction to have scale. I'm so passionate about working with engineers and continuing to work in the most innovative technical fields that I can. And I didn't want to give up the company even though the social network hadn't worked. So just as a matter of necessity, we launched a conference to monetize the network that we had. And it turns out it worked. And so we were able to buy more time where I can continue to invest in working with data scientists and data engineers. I'm doing product advising and some consulting. I'm an advisor for 500 startups, and so I'm always looking for interesting tools for engineers that I can help bring to market. I get a chance to continue to play in the space, and then specifically to your question, through the conference, because it's a cash flow positive business, and it's a growth, has some growth potential because we're in such a hot space. What we want to do with the conference is we want to build the TED for data science, if you will. And when it comes to, content, conference, and community, I think a company like TED did really amazing in their live events, super high quality content. Then they distributed that content really effectively and built a brand on YouTube. I think the third part that maybe they didn't quite do as well as they could is build like real vibrant local communities as sort of the last stage of that strategy. And that's what we see DataEngConf becoming. It's a great event. It's super high quality content. We have a lot of experience with content distribution online from the earliest versions of Hakka and doing content marketing for engineers. And the next stage of that process is to build really amazing, vibrant, worldwide communities for data professionals that we can plug into our network and can get value from the community that we're building.
Yeah, I guess TEDx is a little more of a diluted value than from TED.
Yeah, they tried. I think they tried with TEDx and
Actually, significantly diluted.
right. And it's still like it's kind of like a meetup version of TED.
Right.
And we're playing with that strategy a little bit as well. But I think the question is, how exactly do you build like repeatable, regular, frictionless opportunities for your community to connect, in regional or local areas, apart from running large events, and that's kind of a tricky one, but that's something that we're working on as well.
Yeah, but I do love meetups. I moved to San Francisco recently, and
oh, great.
I don't know I don't know a ton of people. Like I have some close friends, but I don't have like a real community. And doing this podcast, I spend a lot of time in isolation, and I encourage anybody who spends a lot of time in isolation to find some way to socialize, and meetups are an awesome way to socialize. It's really engaging intellectually, and it sounds like you're creating some of those opportunities for data engineers.
Yeah, they really are rewarding. I started, quote, networking, a word that I hate, as a software engineer in New York City in 2000, like way before there were meetups. There was an email list called Gary's List and some others that people would promote tech events on. But now with Meetup, it's amazing. And living in a place like SF, there's so much going on every night. But I welcome you to check out our SF Data Engineering Meetup or come to DataEngConf. We're going to have our largest event in San Francisco yet this spring in April with over 500 software engineers, data scientists, the people who are curious about that field from a technical standpoint. So I invite you to come. You should come.
Yeah, I will.
We'll hook you up with a ticket.
Okay, that sounds great. Okay, well, so as we begin to wrap up, what are the economics like for a software conference? Because I hear some people tell me like it's kind of a tough business, conference fatigue. It's hard to get a lot of people to come. But then I talk to other people, and they're like, "This business is great. The economics are really good. Maybe it doesn't scale exponentially. It scales linearly, but it's still a good business." What's your sense of the economics?
Yeah, I'm just kind of learning the economics myself. From what I hear, old school conferences, old school meaning before 2000, printed money. I used to work at Ziff Davis in the late 90s, which was, part publisher, part online site, part conference business. So they're kind of maybe one of the last like traditional sort of old school media companies that put all those things together. And Hakka, I kind of see us as a new school version of some of those things,
right?
With vastly superior internet distribution, which theoretically should improve the economics. Although just the economics of the conference business, it costs a lot to rent out space, and it costs even more to feed people quality food. So, I'm learning to be sort of up my game in terms of event production, but thankfully I have a lot of help there. But we're able to support the company with 2 or 3 events a year and support the team. And I'm excited. Like I said, for me, it's just about buying time to continue to like work with engineers in a data way, in a startup founder way.
Sure.
I just love this community, and for me to be able to live where I live and run events for engineers and put them together and see their eyes light up when smart people meet smart people. And for me to be able to create a living, doing that, it's just super, super rewarding, and I'm super happy to be doing it.
Yeah. No, that's how I feel about the podcast. It's good business. Fun to talk to people such as yourself. Cool. Well, Pete, thanks for coming on the show. I look forward to checking out DataEngConf. I'm sure I'll do some interviews about the conference around that time. Hopefully I can talk to some of the speakers that are coming. I've done that with a bunch of O'Reilly conferences. And
that's great.
I love
cool.
I love the O'Reilly conferences. I love I've had a good relationship with them. They've given me tickets, and I've gotten to do some very interesting shows about topics from those. So hopefully I can do that with DataEngConf.
Yeah, I would love to do that. If you want to get hooked up with any data scientists or data engineers and working on interesting projects, we definitely like be willing to help you out with that, and that could be
cool.
Great for everyone.
All right. Well, Pete, thanks for coming on the show. Good talking to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Talk to you soon.
Thanks to Symfano for sponsoring Software Engineering Daily. Symfano is a custom engineering shop where senior engineers tackle big tech challenges while learning from each other. Check it out at symfano.com/sedaily. That's SYMPHONO.com/sedaily. Thanks again, Symfano.